In this basic Adobe Illustrator demonstration, I'm going to talk about digital color models. How do you access them? What do they mean? What happens when you do access them? What are some of the options? It's fun to play with color, it's fun to mix color, and we're going to talk about the RGB color model, CMYK, grayscale, and HSB. Now, RGB is familiar to most of us as we have maybe had science class or art classes where we learned about the RGB color spectrum. And RGB is related to if you were to shine light, white light through the prism, and it separates the color spectrum into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So it's that color spectrum, and that is why RGB is considered an additive color model. As you add different bits of light, it's trying to mimic or emulate that color spectrum. CMYK is primarily used for print, and it's related to the inks that printers have on their printers: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So that's what CMYK actually stands for, and that's a subtractive color system. And we'll look at that as in a little bit, because it shows how you subtract percentages of each of these inks. You start with 100% of each of these inks and you subtract from that to print onto white paper, and that's how you get the colors that you see. It's the mix of those percentages of inks. And then the grayscale is just black to white. HSB stands for hue, saturation, and brightness, and that can be very helpful if you're trying to create more vibrancy or less vibrancy in the colors that you create. So let's get started. If I had two basic paths drawn on to the artboard, we got a circle and a star, and they start off in their default appearance with, white fill and black stroke or outline. We want to change those colors. The first way to access a color is you can bring up the color panel. This is just one of the many ways that you can access color, but it's the first way I'm going to show you. And you can find this icon here in your floating panels. Now I'm using the Essentials workspace. If you do not see that, you can go under Window and Color, and it brings up this little box here. Now I have a spectrum that I can choose from, and the reason that it's showing us the CMYK spectrum right now is because I have this particular document set up for CMYK. To choose your document setup, you can change it in the drop-down menu under File, Document Color Mode, and you can select from CMYK or RGB. So if we were an RGB color, see how that changes the document type? And then if I bring up my color panel, now as I go across here, it's showing CMYK spectrum, but I can change that here. Now I've got the RGB spectrum. So it's a good idea to understand the relationship between what spectrum is being shown, how you choose different spectrums here, but how that can be in conflict to the document setup. If I was going to export something for the web, I might want to definitely work in the RGB color spectrum. If I wanted to set something up for print, because remember CMYK is working with printers, inks, and the way their printers are set up, I would want to go into File, Document Color Mode, CMYK color. So let's look at this color panel. Let's work in CMYK, and notice that I can just simply choose colors here. I first need to select an item on the artboard, and then notice that my fill color is in the front. Now I can toggle or swap fill and stroke back and forth here, or I can bring the stroke to front and change that color. So this is letting me know that I want to change the stroke color because it's in front of the fill color. If I want to change, and you can see that reflected there, I changed the stroke color. If I wanted to change the fill color, I have to first make sure that fill is in front of the stroke color. I can of course choose from the spectrum here if I wanted to. And I can use my little eyedropper. Even though I have the selection tool here selected, it changes to eyedrop as I hover over the spectrum. Now if I show options, I get into a little more detail of the CMYK ink percentages. And you can see that those percentages are shown here. I can type in very directly specific numbers and see how those percentages change, and it's reflected here on the screen. One thing to note, that there's a tough thing in calibrating what you see on screen versus what the printer is actually going to print. And that's something where you really need to develop a relationship with a printer to help calibrate what you see on screen as close as possible to what they will be able to print. And that takes a little bit of time in getting to know the printer, your printer of choice. But this really does try to show you to its best ability what's going to be printed within the gamut of the CMYK percentages. Now the reason CMYK is called a subtractive color model is, notice how black, if I take the black color slider, which I know it's counterintuitive, it's represented by the K. If I bring that to 100%, it changes the color that I see, showing 100% black ink applied cancels out all the other colors. But as I pull back on the amount of black ink that's applied, as I subtract the percentage of black ink, that updates my color. Again, there's 100% magenta showing in mixture with the other colors. All you really see is the magenta. As I subtract the percentage of that ink, now we really see how these inks would mix as they're printed onto white paper. So that's the CMYK color model. I can choose now the RGB color model, which is more appropriate for web delivery and is often what the default color mode is with photographs as they come in, if you're familiar with working in Adobe Photoshop. And I can drag. Now notice these are not expressed in percentages, but again I have color sliders, red, green, and blue color sliders that I can click and drag and note the changes as those amounts. And these amounts are reflecting colored light. Think of the prism, and it's the amount. So as I add more red to this item, notice how it becomes pinker. If I add more blue to this item, it would get a little more purple. So it really has a lot to do with your relationship to color and color theory, and just possibly experimenting with the color sliders and just see what happens. Notice this number. What is this number on the bottom right of your color panel? It's 6 digits. It's related to the web. It's a web code. It's called the hexadecimal system. Hexadecimal system indicating 6 numbers and letters that encode tell the computer screen what color to display. So that's the hexadecimal equivalent. Now sometimes you may know an exact hexadecimal equivalent that you could type in there. For example, I happen to know that one of the lighter gray colors, hexadecimal equivalent, is actually 6 C's. So I could even type in directly C, 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 C. I hit return, and it changes this to that light gray color. So some of the colors I know just from doing web design and web work, I know that hexadecimal equivalent. So it's an interesting thing for you to see here, that you can find out what the hexadecimal equivalent is, especially if you needed to communicate to a programmer. about a certain color that you've mixed in the RGB color spectrum. Notice though, as we're working in the color mixer, again, our document color mode is still CMYK, and you can always change that under File, Document Color Mode. So this is your color mixer. You have the opportunity to make things more saturated, less saturated, or brighter and darker. So the hue slider, saturation slider, and brightness allow even further options for mixing colors. You can let the computer know, what end of the spectrum you want to be working in. And you can also let it know how intense the saturation is related to intensity of the color. So you can let it know how intense you want that color to be. And then you can also let it know how bright or how light or dark you want that to be. Saturation is related to the amount of gray that's mixed into the color. So as we slide backwards on that color and we reduce the percentage of saturation, notice how the color gets more gray. If you were literally mixing paint and you wanted to create a less saturated color, you would add more gray to the color. So that gives you even more flexibility. And you could convert the item also to grayscale, which is the percentage of black ink applied. So 75% of black ink is this darker gray versus 25%. And then the web-safe RGB colors, it restricts the hexadecimal system to the web-safe 216. At one time in web development, you were very limited to the number of colors that could show on screen. Early digital displays could only show like 256 colors. So in order for web developers to show things that were possible to be seen across a wide variety of platforms, even video game developers were limited to actually 216 colors that were cross-platform compatible. It's not so much the case anymore, as most digital displays are capable of showing millions of colors. But this is showing you the little hexadecimal color equivalent and how those are mixed. It's very fascinating to see how you can mix those hexadecimal colors using the sliders. So it's fun to play with the various color sliders. And in a later demonstration, I'll show you how to add colors. If you get to a color that you really like and you want to use it again on different items on stage or things that you're creating, illustrations that you're making, you can actually create new swatches. You can create swatches and swatch groups, and we'll get into that in a later demonstration. Another thing you can do for mixing colors is bring up the color picker. The way that I like to bring up the color picker is to double click on either the fill or the stroke. So if the fill is in the front, and that's what we're working with at this moment, I can double click and it brings up my color picker. And this is kind of cool because you can see the full gamut. And you can just click anywhere on that color gamut to select a color. But the other cool thing about the color picker is it brings up the different mixing. You can see all three: hue, saturation, and brightness. You can see the RGB equivalents, the CMYK percentages, and the hexadecimal equivalent. So the color picker is really cool because it allows you to, I can change the brightness of the color that I'm currently working with. Now, one question that often comes up is, remember that we're working in CMYK mode in this document. Current document color mode is CMYK. A lot of students will ask, well, what is this exclamation point? What is this warning? So what's wrong with this color purple? And if I hover over this exclamation point, it says out of gamut warning. and I can click to correct. And that's just telling me that this particular purple would be awfully difficult for printers to mix, that it might be too saturated or too far outside of the normal CMYK color gamut in order to be reproduced. So if I click on this exclamation point, it'll select the nearest neighbor or the nearest equivalent that they can safely recreate in the CMYK color percentages. So that's a little handy thing to know when working with printers, or understanding, what can be printed, what can be easily reproduced. And Illustrator does a pretty good job of letting you know when there might be a potential problem with the color. Now I've changed my color in the color picker. I click OK, and it updates the item on the artboard. And I can bring that up for fill or stroke. If I click on the stroke to bring it to the front, and let's make the stroke a little bit wider, something that would be easy for you to see, I can use my color sliders to choose. Let's try CMYK, and I can choose different colors for that stroke color as well. So another thing to keep in mind is the stroke or the fill that you have brought to front by clicking on it is the one that you are currently mixing, or the one that you are currently working with. If I double click on the stroke, it brings up my color picker, and I can make those adjustments again. Click OK, and it updates it. So those are some fun things to play with, and I encourage you to work with these two shapes, or any shapes that you want to draw on the artboard, and just make some updates. Another interesting thing to also see between the color mixer and the color picker is that if I just bring up swatches and make those updates or make changes to the item that's selected, notice how that update is reflected in the fill and stroke here as well. And you can bring up the default swatches under Window and Swatches, and that'll bring up this particular panel, which gives you all kinds of options and allows you to choose from your swatches library and color books, which we will get into in more detail later. And this concludes your introduction to digital color models, why we use them, and what the relationship is between what you're doing to an item on the artboard, the relationship to changing the color to the fill and the stroke, depending on which one is selected here, and how you can show the options, show and hide the options for the color sliders, and choose different digital color models from this drop-down menu using your window and color panel. So have fun playing with these different options, and just observe, watch what happens as you make changes, and just get a better understanding of these digital color models.